shuddering horror. So did I the first time.
Over the years, British film censors have mostly fretted about sex, but horror has always come a close second. As we saw in horror comics and video nasty scares, the very idea is upsetting to the sensorial mind, which sees the morbid, the sinister, the gruesome or the downright scary as being inherently unsavoury and dangerous to simple, uneducated folk who will be damaged, corrupted or warped by such ideas. In the 1930s, a new film rating was introduced to restrict access to such lurid fare. This is the story of the short-lived and divisive H certificate. The idea of horror being something inherently unsuitable for younger and more vulnerable viewers is a belief that has long gripped the British Board of Film Censors, as was, and the British Board of Film Classification, as is. Even as monster movies were being shown at kiddie matinees in the US, the British censors were slapping adults-only certificates on them. Ludicrously, even such harmless fare as King Kong vs Godzilla was being rated X by the BBFC as late as the mid-1960s, banning it to the under-16s that might have been reasonably thought to be its target audience. Even now, old and harmless horror movies from the 1950s and earlier are still often restricted to the over-12s, the mere nature of the narrative being enough to make them unsuitable for the delicate sensibilities of younger children. In fact, the BBFC was so immediately stressed at the idea of horror films that within a year or so of the genre becoming a recognised thing with the Universal monster movies, it had imposed a special classification to deal with them. From 1913, the BBFC had two film ratings, U and A. The former was, then as now, for entirely wholesome movies that were suitable for all ages. The latter was to signify that a film had more adult themes and so might not be suitable for younger viewers. But significantly, neither actually had an age restriction. Like the U and PG of today, they were strictly advisory. But then came Universal's Dracula and Frankenstein, along with all the other horror films that followed in their wake. These frightening films were a new and disturbing thing for the British authorities, always concerned that the lower orders might be corrupted by new and worrying art forms, even if the films were based on classic novels of English literature that had already been adapted for the stage. Literature and the theatre have always been seen as more respectable than cinema in the UK, and if that's true now, imagine how things might have been when talking pictures was still new and novel. Clearly something needed to be done about these films, and while banning them might have been an option, there was that pesky literary element to them. Could British censors ban films based on the works of Shelley, Stoker and Poe without raising uncomfortable questions from the chattering classes? What was needed was a new category that singled these films out as unsavoury in nature, a warning to both parents and those with delicate sensibilities. In 1933, at the urging of the newly formed government body Film Censorship Consultative Committee, the BBFC began to single out these unpleasant films, passing them with an A certificate but notifying the Home Office that they were of a particularly horrific nature. What the Home Office did with this information is unclear, but the films that they were informed about included the cartoon spoof King Klunk. This paved the way for a specific rating that would ensure that these unsavoury films were seen by adult audiences only, the H certificate. In May 1937, the H was officially made the BBFC's first age-restricted category, with the certification of The 13th Chair, a rather plodding and decidedly unhorrific science-based detective thriller. That it wasn't a full-blooded monster movie that received the first H is interesting, and signalled that this new adults-only rating was going to be rather more expansive than people had perhaps expected. The establishment of the H gave some sort of official recognition to the horror film in Britain. Recognition is not respectability, of course. In the BBFC's annual report of 1935, the organisation's president, Edward Short, commented, "Although a separate category has been established for these films, I am sorry to hear that they are on the increase, as I cannot believe that such films are wholesome, pandering as they do to the morbid and horrible." And this was hardly an anything goes category. Around the same time that the H was being tested out, the BBFC rejected Freaks, Island of Lost Souls and The Monster Walks outright. The latter was past H within a few years. The former two had to wait rather longer. Freaks would not receive a BBFC certificate until 1963, when it was finally passed with an X rating.
You're convinced that the thing on this table isn't human?
Its cries are human.
Do you know what it is, what I began with?
No.
An animal? Well, we may as well discuss this frankly, now that you know the facts. I wanted to prove how completely she was a woman.
I'm not beaten. Get everything ready.
For what?
This time I'll burn out all the animal in her. I'll make her completely human.
Island of Lost Souls was not passed until 1958, and even then was cut. The uncut version would not see a British release until it appeared on video in 1996. Over the life of the H certificate, when US horror had eased back considerably on the levels of sadism and lurid horror under the cosh of the Hays Code, the board still banned outright the likes of Bedlam and Buried Alive, while cutting many other movies to make them suitable for UK audiences. You might think that setting up a specific category for horror films would make classification straightforward. From this point onwards, any horror film would be slapped with an H, and that would be that. You would, of course, be wrong. The decisions over what was or wasn't horrific seemed to be very random. The films classified as H include non-horror oddities such as Boy Slaves, A Child is Born, J'accuse, and United Nations war crime film. These non-horror films sit alongside more traditional shockers like The Return of Dr. X, Son of Frankenstein and The Vampire's Ghost, in a curious list of titles that feels all the more random when you realise that films like The Wolfman were past A. The H would prove to have another, more sinister purpose as time went on. During World War II, audiences were deemed, without much evidence it must be said, to have had little appetite for horror, and such subjects were seen as unsuitable for public display. The turning point seems to have been the summer of 1942, when the BBFC decided that any films that would have qualified for the H would now be banned, at least for the next few years. As we saw in the James Furman years decades later, when he put films like Reservoir Dogs and The Bad Lieutenant on indefinite hold for approval during difficult times, this was a common BBFC trick. To say that horror was completely banned during the war years would be a slight exaggeration, but between the BBFC and UK distributors, very little, and only the least unsettling, made its way into British cinemas. Notably, 1946 was one of the busiest years for films being rated H, as distributors began to work through their previously forbidden back catalogue. The H was never a popular film certificate, but by the start of the 1950s it was starting to look like a bit of an anachronism, barely used and unfit for purpose in a world where cinema was becoming more adult. Stuck with a system of advisory ratings and one age-restricted category that only applied to horror, the BBFC faced having to ban or heavily cut many new, serious and acclaimed films that were entirely suitable for adult audiences, but which could hardly be rated H. Something had to change. After much consultation, in 1951 the BBFC announced the X certificate, replacing the H with a rating that more widely covered adult content and restricted admissions to the over 16s, later changed to over 18s. The H, which had barely been used, was quickly forgotten. A pity in a way. I rather imagine that Hammer Films would have worn the H as a badge of honour just a few years later, rather as they did with the X on their early horror films, even respelling the title of the Quatermass experiment to emphasise the adults-only nature of a film that was based on an unrestricted television series. While the H was quickly forgotten as anything other than a curious experiment by the censors, its presence, conscious or unconscious, never quite went away. During the dark days of the video nasty panic, more than one person suggested that we needed a new rating to classify these particularly horrible films, rather than simply banning them, similar to the R18 then being launched for adult movies. An 18 plus perhaps, or maybe an 18H, to emphasise their horrific nature. Needless to say, such ideas were laughed off by the authorities. How quickly they forget.
Research is taking place and it will show that these films not only affect young people, but I believe they affect adults as well.
So here then is a somewhat incomplete list of the films that were given the H certificate once it became an official age-restricted rating, bearing in mind the lack of accessible, confirmable information that is currently available. BBFC records are, of course, woefully inaccurate. For instance, The Mad Ghoul is listed on their awful website as being past X in 1945, 6 years before that certificate existed. This is the most exhaustive listing of H certified films that we can find, as listed in 1973 by Dennis Gifford and cross-referenced with the BBFC. Dennis Gifford also claimed in his 1973 book, A Pictorial History of Horror Movies, that the following films were certified H. But there's no other evidence to back this up, and some of them do seem rather unlikely candidates even by the standards of the time. And for the sake of completeness, here are the A-rated films that were reported to the Home Office for their horrific nature. If anyone out there has a more complete listing, perhaps from the days when the BBFC's website was a useful research resource instead of a corporate puff piece, then please let us know in the comment. I hope you've enjoyed this delve into the forgotten past of British film censorship. If this sort of ancient and forgotten history is your thing, then make sure to like, subscribe, hit the alert bell and share the Overlooked Hotel with friends, enemies and passing strangers. Every interaction helps build the channel. Thanks for watching and I'll see you again soon.